Hello, and welcome to the Gravel Ride podcast, where we go deep on the sport of gravel cycling through in-depth interviews with product designers, event organizers, and athletes who are pioneering the sport. I'm your host, Craig Dalton, a lifelong cyclist who discovered gravel cycling back in 2016 and made all the mistakes you don't need to make. I approach each episode as a beginner to unlock all the knowledge you need to become a great gravel cyclist. This week on the show, we welcome Brian Fruit, the founder of Lizard Skins. Lizard Skins has been part of the cycling industry since 1993. It's been quite an incredible journey for the company. Y'all know how much I love the business side stories behind the brands we know and love. So I was super excited to get into it with Brian and just learn more about the journey. With respect to their bar tape, what I find is interesting is that the material they have is definitely sort of on the gummier side, and you'll hear Brian describe a bit about that product. But also it's worth noting they offer 4 different sizes of kind of the diameter of the bar tape, which really changes the feel. You can go from super thin, i.e. a lot of bar feel, all the way out to kind of Paris-Roubaix style super cush, which I think is an interesting option that you don't see across the board. A lot of times when you go into your local bike shop, you see only 1 diameter tape that's available. So it's an interesting thing to play around with and something I've enjoyed while testing out some of the Lizard Skin tape. Just before we jump in, I need to thank this week's sponsor, the Hammerhead Karoo 2. I am literally in Spain as you're listening to this. I'm recording this intro just before I'm boarding my flight, and definitely thinking about all the adventures I'm going to have on the roads of Girona. I thought about borrowing a computer from the group that I'm going with, but it was from another brand that I had a little bit of a bad experience with way back when. I've come to love many things about my Hammerhead computer and am convinced it's the most advanced GPS cycling computer available today. It's got industry-leading mapping, navigation, and routing capabilities that set it apart from other GPS options. Free global maps with points of interest included, like cafes and campsites, mean that my riding in Girona, I won't be without information. I'll have everything at my fingertips. As I'm saying all this, I'm literally reminding myself that I should go download the country maps, so I've got everything on hand in my Hammerhead Karoo 2 device. Hammerhead gives bi-weekly software updates, so the features are always up to date, and they're always listening. You can provide feedback to the team at Hammerhead, and potentially it's going to end up in a software update. You're not locked to a particular software package because they're always upgrading it. I really look for the climber feature. That's one of my favorite features these days. It was particularly poignant for me when I was riding in Bentonville, Arkansas a few weeks back at the Big Sugar Gravel event. All those punchy climbs, I was really on the limit. I'm much more of a sit and grind on the coastal range here in California. So those punchy climbs were something I wasn't used to. So understanding exactly how far I was to the top and how many candles I could burn staying with the groups I was desperate to stay with really came in handy. So very much recommend the Hammerhead Karoo 2. It's been my exclusive computer for, probably over a year now. I'm not the only one singing its praises. It was named Bicycling Magazine's Editor's Choice in GPS cycling computers for the past 2 years. Take a look on their website. For a limited time offer, our listeners can get a free heart rate monitor with the purchase of a Hammerhead Karoo 2. Just visit Hammerhead.io right now and use the promo code TheGravelRide at checkout to get yours today. Remember, it's an exclusive limited time offer for our podcast listeners. So don't forget that promo code TheGravelRide for that free heart rate monitor strap. With that business behind us, let's jump right into my conversation with Brian. Hey, Brian, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Super glad to be on today.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig into Lizard Skins a little bit, but I'd love to start out, as we always do, by a little bit about your history and how you ultimately got into cycling. And let's talk about the origin story of Lizard Skin.
Well, that's a good one. Yeah, it's been about 3 decades ago now, dating myself a little bit. I was a college student at BYU, and I got my first mountain bike. I worked, most of the summer and saved up some money and got a mountain bike, and and thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed it. Not just for the awesome riding that we were able to do in the mountains, but just as a way to get around campus and commute. It was just so much more liberating than fighting the parking spots. So I just fell in love with cycling. I think from a very small age, I've always loved everything with wheels on it. And then this mountain bike was a revelation. So fast forward a few more years, and I'm a senior about to graduate, and there's a company called Reflex Bikes,
I
and
remember them.
they made these cool lugged frames. Some of them were aluminum tubes, some of them were carbon tubes, and they sold to another company, Look, that makes pedals and things like that.
And did Reflex have some sort of Utah connection, or were
They
you just
had
familiar?
they were making them here in Utah, like
Wow, I didn't know that. I had a girlfriend who had one of those bikes in the very early 90s.
did it creak?
It creaked, and the one thing I remembered about it was that there was some really challenging cable routing. So when it came
Wow.
time to build it up, it was like a nightmare getting something through the bottom bracket, I think was what I struggled with.
Yeah, so it's a cool bike, and it had a great designer, and he had sold the business and moved over to Europe actually to work on design there, and apparently there was a trademark issue on the name Reflex, and the people that owned it were no longer willing to allow that name to be used, and so at Look just said, I think we're just done with this. This doesn't make sense for us to be involved with. So they decided to liquidate everything. So rims and cranks and headsets and you name it, bottom brackets, shifters, handlebars, and so they sent out these postcards to all these stores. And my friend worked as a bike patrol at Sundance Ski Resort, brought the little postcard home. And I'm like, that's kind of interesting. So I drove up there the next day and I bought $300 worth of bike parts. Didn't have any money. I was just a college student, and all the way home, like, oh, what am I doing? I don't have $300. This is the worst decision ever. And I sold all those parts that night to just random people in the apartment complex and friends that I rode with. It's because there's no social media back then. This is, early 90s, 92, I believe. And the next day I went up there again, like, being drawn to the, bike parts, like the bug to the blue light zapper, and bought like $300 of the parts again. And all the way home, like, oh, what am I doing? This is the worst decision ever. Sold all those parts again. And that was it. Over the next 6 weeks, I was buying and selling parts, and I sold them to bike stores, and I sold them to individuals, and I sold about $30,000 worth of parts, made a decent amount of money on that, bought my wife a wedding ring and saved up a little money for us to get married, and that's kind of how my life got started, in the bike world. I just kind of fell in love with the whole scene, and not the people, but even like the smells. When you walk into a bike store, I just like the smell of a bike store. I know that sounds weird, but it just feels right in bike stores. Even when I'm on vacation, I like to go try to find a bike store to pop my head in and look around. So,
That's an amazing kind of origin story, and I love the name dropping of Reflex. It brings back very, very
oh,
fond memories for me. So, did you continue sort of pursuing kind of like a distribution type
so,
business model?
so that lasted for about 6 weeks. They were selling all those parts at this big discount, and just kind of made me think, man, something in the bike industry would be really fun. And we looked at two or three ideas, and none of them actually worked out. And then a friend introduced me to another friend, and that guy's name was Lance Larson. And Lance had this idea of making neoprene and Velcro accessories for bicycles and calling them lizard skins. And but Lance wasn't a rider, and he wasn't really familiar with the space. So he and I connected, and in the simplest terms, the original premise was that he would make the products and I would sell them. It didn't really work out exactly like that. There was a lot more crossing over back and forth, But Lance and I got to work together for 8.5 years and built the company from nothing. The very first month, we did $350 of annual sales. So
And do you
it was,
remember what the first product was that you came out with?
yeah, it was the little neoprene and Velcro chainstay protector. And man, they were small back then. It was like a really small length and really small diameter. And now, they make the tubes so much larger. The
Yep.
old one fit on a bike today.
Yep.
And
Yeah. If you think about those old steel tube
oh,
chainstays that used to wrap, they were tiny, like the size of your pinky.
yeah, so small. Exactly. And we made all kinds of fun colors, and we made these little headset seals that would keep the dirt and grime out of the headset. And then eventually we started making fork boots, which would keep the dirt out of the front fork because the seals back then weren't very good. And then we made a same kind of a boot for the rear shock, and
Yeah.
eventually started making rubber injection molded grips. And then we added in some BMX products. We made BMX pad sets and BMX plates and BMX shin guards and elbow guards. And then, I bought my partner out, and that took several years, and there wasn't a lot of extra cash, because everything just seemed to go to him to buy him out. And eventually we got that all done, and then we were able to really kind of move forward more dramatically because we had some money to work with.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I think back across that period that you're describing, and I do remember those original lizard skin chain guards, but I remember more like the arrival of color. Because back in the early 90s, certainly on the mountain bike scene, that was the heyday of anodized parts and
Oh
finding
yeah.
any way to make your bike a little bit more colorful and have a little flair to it.
Oh, people were putting on Kuka cranks and Cook brothers and Paul components, and everything was purple and red and yellow and green. And yeah, you could buy a Chris King headset and it was all Rastafari. And
Yeah,
um,
100%,
that was
100%.
fun time.
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was like there was so much innovation going on back then in the world of mountain bikes, and I mean, I think that's what I've enjoyed about the last several years in the gravel bike world is you just see that kind of innovation. No one knows exactly what's right, and the bike designers have been given a lot of freedom to design bikes that range from a road plus bike to a full on bike packing bike, and they're all in this quote unquote new genre of gravel cycling.
Oh, it is fun. I rode a friend of mine's bike packing bike just earlier this week, and it was super fun. It just had a cool geometry to it, and he had outfitted mountain bike brakes onto his drop bar controls, and it had some significant brakes. He's a bike store guy, and he figured out how to do it. It was awesome.
At what year did you sort of transition your business partner out and start to think really like what new products could you innovate around?
Yeah, so I bought him out in 2001. Early part of 2001. And we the philosophy then was like turn over every rock, just if nothing else, to see what was underneath. And we bought different equipment to do our manufacturing with. We just really tightened up to try to make everything more, frankly, more profitable and more efficient.
Yeah, I meant to ask earlier, at what point did you bring manufacturing in-house and what does that look like from an equipment perspective?
So we were making these little neoprene and Velcro accessories in the United States from day one, and still do 30 years later. So what it takes is, I mean, we did it differently. In the old days, the equipment we used wasn't very efficient. We've got really good stuff now. And so it's a die press with a steel rule die, and then that allows you to cut the fabric out in these perfect shapes.
Yep.
And anybody that's working on the die press the first day, you have to make sure and tell them, if you're dropping the die, or if the die is slipping out of your hands, just let it hit the ground. Like, don't try to catch it, because it's sharp.
Sharp all over. Yep.
We can fix the die. It's not a
And then
big deal.
after you're die cutting the neoprene, are you then going into a sewing
Yep.
process?
have
Yeah.
really nice commercial sewing machines. We use a zigzag stitch on it, and we sew that in house with different sizes of Velcro on each side, and then kind of do some trimming to make it look good. And then we package it up all done in the US. So that was a good thing, and we were able to make a super high quality product, and we sold a lot of those. Eventually a lot of the brands started adding some type of a chain protector or chain stay guard
Yep.
to the bikes, and it definitely impacted our sales. But we added these other products, injection molded grips, and eventually we created a great relationship with ODI, where they made a significant line of lock-on grips for us under their patent and technology, but sold by us under our name and to our customers.
And was ODI manufacturing in the US as well?
That's correct. Yep. They're out in California, actually. So, it's like double hard in the United States and California. Great product, and they have great tooling, and they could make these grips just so crisp and clean, and the technology they had is and still have is second to none. So we teamed up with them on lock on grips. And then eventually we really wanted to come up with a lightweight mountain bike grip that was just different. And so we checked into another industry, and we made some appointments, and we started visiting factories hoping to get this lightweight grip, maybe for cross country racing. And unfortunately we weren't successful in finding, that, through maybe another industry. But on that trip, we figured out that we found a company that could make tape for us. And it was literally my general manager, Brad Barker, and he and I were on this trip together. And as we were about to walk out the building, the business, he kind of turned around and asked them, "It's like, hey, could you guys make tape for us?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, we could totally do that." And he says, "Great, I'll be in touch." So, he says, "Brian, I really want to try this. I really want to, sink my teeth into it." So, he was working with the factory back and forth about 9 months and making samples for handlebar tape for road bikes. And the first sample was like 12 or 18 inches long. And we're like, well, this is not going to work. And then the next sample was, really long, but the product didn't stretch. Well, that's not going to work. And so we went through rendition after rendition after rendition, frankly, not knowing how to create the proper tech kit to speed the process along, but just trial and error.
And
And
was there something in the road bike market that you felt was missing, like some type of performance out of the grip that you guys saw as an opportunity?
yeah, that's a great question. We did feel like that there could be something different. Most of the tape that was available at that time was the synthetic cork, and it gets dirty and it kind of slippery, and there wasn't really any pizzazz to it or any technical anything. So when we came out with ours, it was completely different. It had a much different texture and feel. It actually felt softer, even though it was the same thickness, and way more grippy. And it was cleanable. You could just take a little alcohol and a clean white rag or something, and you could clean it right up, and it wasn't stained and dirty. Um, so we ended up finding a product that was going to work, and we were really proud of the product we had designed. And then the factory told us how much it was going to cost. And it was like one of those, stressful moments. And we're like, how's this ever going to work? Because bar tape at that time sold for $15 to $20 for, the common synthetic cork.
Yeah.
Ours was going to be $35. And so we're just like, oh, this is going to be tough. But everybody that touched our tape loved it. And so we're like, well, we just got to get people to touch it, because once they do, they'll love it. And
Yeah.
that's where the phrase touch it, feel it, love it came from.
Yeah,
And we,
it is poignant when you put your hands on some lizard skin tape. It feels different.
yeah,
I'm riding it on my bike right now, and everything you've just described is what I've felt about it. Like it feels when I'm barehanded, I often ride barehanded, and I feel much more connected to the grip because of the sort of, I don't know if stickiness is the right word, but this kind of sticky quality that I feel when riding it that's quite different than cork grip.
Yeah, it's grippy, and it's from this patented, technology and material that our partner supplier created in tandem with us, and it's just been absolutely wonderful. We
It's so interesting to me, as sorry to interrupt, Brian, just as like a business journey, you sort of realize, hey, we've got something unique here, but I can't tell you about it. You've got to feel it and touch it to believe and see. And I can imagine, like in the bike industry, that's a challenge, right? To kind of just translate that into the hands of enough people to develop a passionate following to say, I'm willing to pay this premium price for this performance now that I know about it.
so I happened to be on a family trip, and again, I love bike stores, right? So we have a distributor in Guatemala that was selling our product, and they had a bike store. So I went and visited that store while we were on this family trip, and there was a customer that came in, and he had a road bike. I think it was a tri bike actually, and the handlebar tape was all falling off, and I just happened to hand him my handlebar sample that I had, and he just fell in love with it. And he told the manager owner of the store there, he's like, I want this. And we told him kind of what the price was, and that's a lot of money in Guatemala. And he's like, no, I want that tape, like, so give me that tape. And that's kind of how it's worked. Like, we pay a ton more for our tape. It's not that we make a lot of money on it, we actually have a pretty tight margin on it, but the manufacturing cost is just a lot more because of what the product is and the materials that are used. But once you feel it, it's like, yeah, yeah, I'm gonna splurge, and I'm this is what I want.
So, are you still using the same manufacturing partner
We
today?
are, yeah, and they've come up with new technology and improvements to the polymer to make it even more grippy and even more durable. So it's been nice. We did a complete redesign on the tape a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now, and the new tape actually has a pattern on it. And if you looked at that pattern with like a jeweler's loop or a magnifying glass, you would see that the pattern is like it's multi depth. So some of the little bumps are really deep, some are less deep, some are really shallow, just to maximize the feel and control on the bike, with these different dimensions into the pattern.
Yeah.
So pretty technical.
Yeah, I think as riders, we benefit from your obsession over this one little part of the bike to say, how can we make it the best it can be?
I mean, down that same conversation, and this is me telling a bad story about myself, unfortunately, not a good business story. But our plug that we had was really cool looking. It was shiny and had the little lizard on it, but it did have a tendency to fall, if you didn't leave enough tape tucked in. So some people it worked great and it never fell out, but other people it fell out. So I wanted to get a new screw-in plug, and unfortunately we allowed ourselves to run out of plugs during that process, and I lost $1 million of sales just because we didn't have the actual plug that I wanted. And I didn't want to go back to the old plug because in my mind I'd already moved on to the new plug, and the supplier for the new plug was being a turkey and not making them for us, and I had actually switched suppliers, and but honestly now we have an amazing screw-in plug, which is a super simple thing. Like, it shouldn't even be like a big thought, but it probably cost me a ton of money making that transition just because we didn't want to continue on with the old one, and we didn't have our ducks in a row on the new one. We thought we did, but
I think
but now,
I think anybody who's ever manufactured anything can commiserate with that story, myself included.
but now we got a great plug, and the supplier's good, and everything's functioning well. So
One of the things when you visit the Lizardson Skin site as a customer is that the first thing you see is an array of colors, and you're like, great. If I want to create some accent color. Like you just have so many different unique colors available for the bar tape. But when you select your color and you get into it, you also then realize there's this secondary, probably much more important from a performance perspective, opportunity to choose your thickness of color. For most riders, you probably buy bar tape and you don't even think about it. I don't know what the average is. Maybe it's a 2.5 millimeter, but on your site, you've got, I think it's 1.8 millimeter, 2.5, 3.2, and 4.6 millimeter bar tape, which is a pretty wide array.
So when we started this journey on making handlebar tape, we really tried to figure out what everybody else was doing and trying to get understanding. So we were out there with a micrometer trying to measure it, and kind of the normal standard tape out there was about 2.5 millimeters, but nobody ever called that out. There was never any technical data. It was just a box and it said, handlebar tape with no detail. So we came out originally with the 2.5, which is still our very best seller, and it's kind of the most common that you would see. But we had a request for some thinner tape, and there were some customers that said, "Oh man, you need to make it a little thinner." So then we came out with a 1.8 in limited colors, um, and we found that certain people and in certain applications really like the thinner product, and especially people with a little bit smaller hand, because they just couldn't get their hand comfortably around, this big fat bar, big fat tape. And then we had a lot of people. It's like, oh, why don't you make a thicker tape? And I think they were like, man, if you're going to make a thinner one, why don't you make a thicker one? So then we came out with a 3.2, and the packaging was bigger. Everything about the thing is just bigger, and people loved it. Like, man, it quickly became a great seller for us. Not better than the 2.5, but it was better than the 1.8, in fact. And so we've done real well with the 3.2, and it lays down nice. And we just had certain customers, wanting to do gravel rides, cobbles. Maybe they just have hands that hurt. Could be an injury, just could be the way they are on the bike, but their hands just go numb and get sore. They wanted more cush, and so some people would like double wrap their bars, but that has some challenges to it. So we came out with this 4.6, and it's a beast. It is a big old fat roll, but super comfortable when you get it on. It is a little harder to lay it down, in all honesty. If you're wrapping 2.5, that's pretty easy. 3.2 takes a little more finesse, and 4.6, it takes a decent amount of experience to make it lay nice and flat.
Yeah, it's
But
interesting to layer in those options for gravel cyclists. Obviously, like on this podcast, had lots of discussions around, how do you create suspension? You start with your body, then the tires, then grip tape's going to play a role in there. And again, for all the reasons you're just talking about, for some people, they're really taking a lot of abuse in their hands for one reason or another. Maybe they've got an injury. And I could see having that option available to them, even if it's for a special purpose, a special event, wrapping your bars in a separate way. I remember back in the Paris-Roubaix classic days, when you were talking about people doing double wrap bar tape, everybody was consorting themselves in the pro peloton to find some way to make their bikes more comfortable for days like Paris-Roubaix.
yeah, and there's been a few different products made, like little gel packs and little foam pieces and stuff to put underneath there, and they work to some degree, but the gel packs will break or they'll get kind of wiggly, and the handlebar tape doesn't work well with it. And by doing this nice 4.6 and the 3.2, like, it just fits. It's just there. It's solid. You don't have to worry about a bump or a weird spot on there, and it's been successful.
And as I understand things, you've been also getting feedback from a couple pro tour teams for the bar tape.
We were very fortunate to get a pro tour team to use the handlebar tape many, many years ago. That first team was Vacansale, and this is kind of like a Forrest Gump moment. but they were using our tape, and one of their riders, Johnny Hoot, always be indebted to him. He was leading the polka dot jersey competition, the mountain points in the Tour de France, and it was a flat part of the beginning of the tour. So ultimately, he was doing breakaways and getting these points. And on one of those days that he was in a breakaway, getting a handful of mountain points, a press car bumped him and another rider, and they went off the road and into a barbed wire fence. And they hit that fence so hard that it actually pulled the wood posts out of the ground. And as just hardcore professionals, they got back on the bike, all cut up and dazed, and jerseys and shorts all ripped up from the barbed wire. And their team gives them a push, and off they go. You know, at the end of the race, Johnny gets off, and he had been bandaged by the medical car, and they're trying to bandage him as he's riding his bike. So by the time he finished the race, most of the bandages were falling off. It was a mess. And they interviewed him afterward, and his attitude was like, this was an accident. I wished it wouldn't happen. This is going to really mess up my opportunities at the tour, but it could have been worse. Let's move on. The other gentleman rider that got hit had a very different take. His team was trying to find out who was responsible, who was going to pay. It was just very bitter. And interestingly enough, everyone fell in love with Johnny. And he started looking at his bike and what size chain rings he used and what kind of bike it was and what was his saddle and what kind of handlebar tape he used. Oh my goodness, our handlebar tape started selling like crazy. So all the distributors started having a run on the product, and they ran out of Lizard Skins bar tape, and boom, that was it. That was our Forrest Gump moment. Handlebar tape became the most popular aftermarket tape in the world, and it was because one guy was cool, in a bad situation,
and thrown into a barbed wire fence. I remember those images.
Oh, but he just handled it right. I think a
Yeah.
lot of times in life we all have bad things that happen to us that are out of our control, but it's how we handle those things that kind of impact, how we interact with the rest of the world.
Yeah. As
And
you remind me of that story, I remember very viscerally thinking about, gosh, this is going to be another prima donna roadie that has a tantrum. And I remember how you described like the other team, the other rider, it was just this big to do. And, who's going to pay for this? And how do we replace how he would have done throughout this tour, juxtaposed to how Johnny handled it and how their team handled it.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. So
Yeah.
taught me, a great lesson, right? Of, it's important to manage how we react, to potentially bad things, happening to us. So, how we behave can really, change overall how something goes down.
Yeah.
So,
Such an amazing journey, and so cool that you've been able to do it using US manufacturing all this time. I love that part of the story. Before I let you go, Brian, I did want to touch on one other thing because I think it's interesting. I mean, the gravel cyclist should go to your site and check out the different dimensions of bar tape and all those cool colors you have. Great product. It definitely delivers that kind of grippiness and unique feel that we were talking about earlier. But I was also bemused to learn that you're also into several different sports. And I think the listeners would kind of dig hearing just a little bit about your journey into those other sports.
you bet. So, handlebar tape was doing extremely well, and one of the guys from work, Brad Barker, that helped design the tape originally, he loved baseball. He had boys that were playing on baseball teams. Had another friend from college that gave me that little postcard for the sale at Reflex, actually. He was one of the guys that helped me feed my mountain bike passion. He had three boys that loved baseball, and they were all putting this tape on baseball bats, bicycle tape on baseball bats. So it 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 was like, is there something there? So we started making two thicknesses of baseball grip. We made a 1.1, which is kind of the traditional thickness for baseball, and we made a 1.8, which is a little thicker. Think of the 3.2 in cycling, that kind of thing. And we put it out there. We won best of show for the first trade show we went to, and nothing really happened. But when we sold the stuff into a store, it did sell. So we figured out, it's like, well, we just have to increase the amount of stores. So we eventually got a bunch of stores selling it. And then there was a local pro by the name of John Buck. He connected up with us and wanted to go to a trade show. And we said, that'd be great. You can share our booth and you can show your product in our booth, and it'll be fun. So we start that. And at that show, he brings his bats and we wrap them for him. And the whole time he's like feeling the bat, while talking to customers about his products. And at the end of the show, he's like, if you made this thinner, I would use it in the pros, and I would get other people to use it in the pros, and I think you'd have something. So Brad came back from that show, and we talked, and he says, this is the conversation. And we both looked at each other like 130 years of history with people using like sticky stuff, pine tar, on baseball bats. Like, how in the world are we going to change that tradition? Like, that's never going to happen. And we're like, yeah, probably not. And they were like, what should we do? And we both agreed, it's a pro player. We should probably make it. So we did. We made a thinner version, a 0.5, really, really thin. And John started using it. Hunter Penn started using it. Big Poppy started using it. Miguel Cabrera. I mean, just tons of these great players, and they were sluggers. And eventually we got invited to go to the equipment manager show for Major League Baseball, which then led to us getting a license with Major League Baseball, where we became the official bat grip on-field license for Major League Baseball, and it was amazing. And our sales grew, which allowed us to hire more people and get into a bigger, better facility, and hire more designers, and then continue to make more products and grow the company.
Yeah, because now you're in baseball, hockey, lacrosse, as well as cycling.
And recently we just added pickleball.
Of course. The rise of pickleball. That is the moment in time we're in.
So and each of these sports, the product is different. So we're not just repackaging, we're actually redesigning the product each time. So, how long it needs to be, what's the thickness, what type of a backing do we use? For cycling, we use an EVA backing, but for baseball, we use a felt backing.
Yeah.
Different patterns, and the gripping qualities on the patterns are very different. So we've replicated ourselves effectively in all these different sports.
When you think about the business now, what percentage is cycling versus everything else?
Wow. I mean, in 2020, there was a surge, and cycling was the biggest part of the 2021. It was still great. 2022, cycling sales have slowed a little bit because there's a lot of inventory that's been shipped out there. So baseball is now the biggest part of the business. Cycling is second, and then hockey would be third.
Gotcha.
So
yeah, super interesting story. Totally appreciate you sharing the journey with me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Oh, you bet. It's been a lot of fun. I look back, I wouldn't have wanted to go a different route. I've loved the cycling industry, and I actually started Lizard Skins, and then several years later, I started a bike store. And then a couple years later, I bought another bike store, and I still have those bike stores. They're great. I love them, and it feels like walking into the Cheers bar, from that sitcom. So
Yep.
when you go in the bike store, that's what it feels like. It's just like it's another home, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah, we all I hope that many of the listeners out there have that kind of relationship with their local bike shop, because I certainly do in my town. I love going there. I love seeing all the team that works there and just saying hi and having that familiar, love of the sport that you can share.
Yeah, it's just, fun getting to have friends continue to come in and get to see them. I mean, it's almost like a little mini family reunion, like every day that you go in the store. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, have a great weekend, Brian, and we'll talk again soon.
appreciate it. Take care.
That's going to do it for this week's edition of the Gravel Ride Podcast. Big thanks to Brian from Lizard Skin for joining us. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about his journey and are intrigued by some of the other product categories that they've found themselves in over the years. Definitely go check them out at lizardskins.com. As I mentioned earlier, that bar tape's been interesting trying out the different diameters. I'm still in the 2.4 camp, but I am curious about that 1.8 thickness bar tape as well. If you're interested in connecting with me, please join the Ridership. That's www.theridership.com. That's a free global cycling community. It's hosted on Slack, so it's basically a Slack channel that you can communicate with other gravel cyclists from all around the world. If you're able to support the show, please visit buymeacoffee.com/thegravelride, where ratings and reviews are hugely appreciated. Until next time, here's to finding some dirt under your wheels.